Hi guys. Okay, so welcome to the class element of the course, okay? Um and yeah, so this is a video. Um there's going to be quite a lot of text. This week we're going to discuss the main ideas of what I think are the main ideas of the two readings that I assigned, the Hugh Lemmy and Ben Miller book Bad Gays, or the introduction and conclusion to that, and also the sections from Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. I uploaded full versions of those books too, as well as advising you to read the extracts. I don't expect you to read the whole books at all, but if you would like to, then you have access to them if you want to look at more of them, okay? So yeah, this week is going to involve a lot of quite dense text. From next week, we will be watching more films. We will be reading poetry. There will be less of the kind of heavy reading necessarily. There will still be some, but there will be less of it. But yeah, this week it's the introduction, and I want to work through some of the key ideas, as I said in the video, in the smaller video, the introduction video, that are going to inform how we're reading the texts in the films that we are going to read on the course. Okay. So yeah, with that in mind, I've called week one "Gender and Sexuality in History." And by in history, I already want to kind of point to this idea that the concepts that we're going to be using to talk about gender and sexuality and queerness, um, you always kind of have to see them as an evolving social phenomenon. They're not ideas which we would say are static, they're not ideas that stay still, but they're ideas that change throughout history. And if we want to understand them, we also have to understand something about the ways in which they've come into being, why people thought in the way in which they did, and maybe the ways in which queerness actually, um, or the idea of queerness actually connects with other ideas, other kinds of sociality, like class or like the economy, or like all kinds of other historical events which are going on at the same time as different ideas and different theories of queerness are being developed. And I want to kind of touch on this week, and then it will become more concrete, hopefully, as we discuss the specific texts in the weeks to come. So I've made this list of questions, which are questions for this week, but they're also almost, I think, questions for the course as a whole, okay? And we start, as you can probably tell, with the first one, which I just mentioned, which would be to say, how have the categories through which we understand gender and sexuality changed throughout history? So the categories by categories here, I mean things like concepts, ideas, the framework or the cadre that we use in order to understand something. How have these ideas and categories changed throughout history? We see in the Bad Gays reading in the Lemmy and Miller book that the very idea of a homosexual identity, be that male, female, or non binary, has only emerged historically relatively recently, and the reasons why these identities emerge and what they tell us about what else is happening in the world and in society can give us a way of reading both history and also where we're at now, and they can help us to understand things about our own position in the world, as I said in the introductory video. So a second question would be, as we've just discussed, how does gender and sexuality connect with other aspects of life, especially with economic relations and with class? And we could also add with race to this, with all kinds of other historical events and also social tendencies. And again, something that we see in both Butler and in the Lemmy and the Miller book is that you can't really think about gender or sexuality or queerness outside of the context of something like law and something like power. So, as we go through the course, we'll explore how ideas of queerness necessarily causes also to question certain understandings of law, certain understandings of morality, certain understandings of maybe what a good life would be. And then the third question is, what would it mean to properly subvert these relations? And by subvert, we mean to turn upside down, to challenge, to behave in a way which is contrary to or against these kinds of economic relations, this kind of class power. What does it mean to do that? And what does it mean to subvert gender expectations, to be queer in the sense of behaving in a way which is against the norm? What does that mean? Again, one of the arguments that Miller and Lemmy make is that it's not homosexuality or queerness or sexual behaviors which go against the norm in and of themselves might not be enough. They might not be subversive all the time. Sometimes they might be the opposite of subversive. Sometimes they might be quite conservative. So we want to be asking ourselves these questions too, or we're going to be asking ourselves these questions. And then all of that leads up to a question which we will ask ourselves again and again throughout the course, which is from a kind of perspective of queerness, from a perspective which is outside of the what we would call the normative, the normal, the conventional mode of behaving sexually. What does emancipation look like? At what point could we say that someone is living an emancipated life? Is that a social question? Is that a question to do with sexuality? Is that a question to do with how we relate to other people in a sexual but also in a non-sexual way? Does queerness even have to involve a particular kind of sexuality or relationship to gender? Or could it mean sublimating those things? And by sublimating, I mean just getting over them and not thinking about them anymore, acting as if questions of gender and sexuality have actually been overcome and as if they're not relevant anymore. All of these are questions that we will be thinking about and pursuing as we go through the course. Okay, so bear them in mind. I'll come back to them. I hope that you already start to find some of these questions interesting and stimulating for your own thinking, but we will be returning to them, and as we go further and further through, we will see sometimes that maybe the idea of subversion can be contradictory. Some things might be subversive in some ways, but they might also reinforce social norms and negative elements of society in other ways. So it may be that we have to think about subversion sometimes as being quite contradictory. It may be that the idea of subversion on an individual level maybe doesn't make a lot of sense. Maybe we have to think about it from a group perspective. Maybe we have to think about it from the perspective of the whole society. So yeah, these are questions that we're going to be asking ourselves throughout. And I thought in the introductory class, it would be nice to just frame them to make them clear. Okay, so we'll move on to some of the texts that we're going to be looking at this week, or to the two texts that we're going to be looking at this week, both of which are intended, as I say, to introduce critical frameworks or critical perspectives through which we can begin to ask ourselves these kinds of questions. So the first text that we're going to talk about is the book Bad Gays: A Homosexual History, which is a very recent book. It's a book that was published a few months ago by Hugh Lemmy, who is this guy who is a writer from London, and by Ben Miller, who is a writer from the US. And they're both, as you can see, white male, gay leftists, cis male leftists who run a podcast. Bad Gays originally came out of a podcast, and if you like their writing, if you find this book interesting, then I would really, really recommend listening to the podcast. Maybe you know about it already, but it's really interesting, and they do a lot of work on the historical nature of homosexuality, the idea that homosexuality and queerness is not something which stays the same throughout time. It's not something which just has always meant the same thing. People have always had sexual relations with people of their own gender. However, the idea of homosexuality as an identity, the idea that one can call oneself queer or one can call oneself homosexual, and that says something deep down about who one is not that old. And it's come about through a series of historical developments. And something which is important is that when we understand that something has come about through a series of historical developments, we start to see how it might have been different. We start to see how perhaps things could have gone in a different way. Things could have changed, and maybe things could have worked out better than they did, or they could have gone worse too. And Miller and Lemmy, they both are quite critical of what they perceive of a kind of project of homosexuality and of queerness as being a kind of identity. They argue in the book, in the conclusion to the book, and I think in the introduction, that in some way or another that project has failed. It hasn't proved to be emancipatory in a way which was really meaningful. But one of the ways to understand that, or one of the ways to understand that argument, is to begin with the idea, as I do here. This is a quote from the start of the conclusion of the book, that homosexuality is not an ever fixed or fixed mark. It's a contingent identity. So if it's contingent, it means it's changed. It hasn't stayed the same. And it could have been different. If something is contingent, it could have been different. Something developed through a slow accrual of meaning over centuries. So I might sometimes make some extra notes on here, where if there's a word which is especially old or opaque, I'll write it down and then I'll upload this file after the class too. But anaccrual, or to accrue, it refers to gather something together, to collect something slowly over time. So if we say that homosexuality has come about, the idea of homosexuality and the idea of having a homosexual identity has come about through a slow accrual of meaning over the centuries. What we're saying is that it's not something which has always stayed the same, and also that to understand it, you have to understand how its meanings have come about and the purposes and the different historical processes which have gone into forming those meanings. And again, a big argument from from the Lemmy book and the Miller book is this sense that there has been a kind of failure related to emancipation and queerness. And we have this quotation: the failure of mainstream actually existing white male homosexuality to enact a liberation, and its embrace instead of full integration into the burning house of the couple form, the family unit, and what we might hopefully call late stage capitalism, is real, and it is arranged on three primary axes. So the argument that they're making is that an idea of integration, so by integration we mean integrating into society as it is, not challenging society, but trying to become a part of society without fundamentally challenging it. They're arguing that in some way, mainstream homosexual identity has prioritized this sense of integration, and that's part of its failure. It's part of the reason why it has not, Lemmy and Miller want to argue, led to a kind of meaningful emancipatory result. And it says, they argue that there are three reasons, or three things that we can identify within this this mainstream actually existing white male homosexuality, which mark out its failure, or which makes its failure clear. First thing they argue is a separation from and a fear of gender nonconformity. So there's a sense that homosexuality and queerness is an identity amongst what we would call cis individuals, so people whose gender is the same as the gender which they were assigned at birth. That mainstream homosexual identity has distanced itself and in some way has defined itself in relation to an exclusion of and a fear of gender non-conforming individuals. So people who we might refer to as trans, but also trans is not the only identity that someone who is gender non-conforming might adopt. And someone may be gender non-conforming in some aspects of their lives, but not in others. But the basic critique is that the mainstream homosexual identity, and we're going to talk about how homosexuality as an identity itself is a historical phenomenon. It's not something that's always been there. This identity has consistently and continues to define itself according to the exclusion of gender non-conforming people. They also claim that a second element, which marks out the failure of what they call white male homosexuality, is the appropriation of the bodies and sexualities of racialized people and denial of those people's full humanity, political participation, and equality. And we'll talk about this next week when we watch Shirley Clarkson's film Portrait of Jason. But they're arguing that, again, another tendency within what they identify as an existing white male homosexuality, the mainstream, is to both appropriate, so in some way to make use of the bodies and sexualities of people who are not white, who are racialized in some way, and we could say who are exoticized, so who are in some way defined as being different from the norm due to the way in which their race is represented. And also, so the utilization of this, the appropriation of the bodies and sexualities of these people, while simultaneously denying them their full humanity, political participation, and equality. And finally, its incessant focus on what they call the bourgeois project of sexuality itself. And the question that comes up from this final statement is, what is the project of sexuality, and in what way is it bourgeois? What do we mean if we say that the project of sexuality is bourgeois, and how do we understand that in relation to what is being described as the failure of actually existing white male homosexuality to enact liberation, so to bring about a meaningful emancipation, a meaningful liberation. And something that Lemmy and Miller talk about not incessantly, that's the wrong word, sorry, talk about consistently in the introduction to their book is this idea that sexuality itself, and that people have a kind of sexuality, so that people could be homosexual or heterosexual, or what we might call bisexual, or pansexual is now a term which is used. This is very recent, historically speaking. So they argue that it's perhaps only 150 years old, and that it emerges out of industrializing colonial metropolises of Europe. So big cities in Europe, as they industrialize, and also as they're engaging in colonial projects overseas, you start seeing the idea that that someone has a kind of sexuality which in some way is inherent to who they are. And prior to this, Lemmy and Miller argue, and they draw on a number of other writers in order to make this argument, that, so as they put it, they argue that there was no sense that who you fucked made you who you were. So they argue that prior to 150 years ago, or to put it differently, maybe it's only within the last 150 years that you get a really, really fixed sense that there is a kind of essence to you, which is part of which is to do with your sexuality, i.e., to do with who you fuck. And if you have sex, if you're a man, if you're a cis man who has sex with men, or if you're a non-cis man who has sex with men, you could consider yourself to be homosexual, and that would be a part of who you were as a person. Whereas prior to that, they argue that people may have had sex with people of their own gender without having this this sense of identity. And they say even after the invention of homosexuality and heterosexuality, remember, if you don't have homosexuality, the idea of heterosexuality doesn't make any sense either. In the late 19th century, most people who felt same-sex love and desire did not want to convert their feelings into identities, to subscribe to being medicalized and to being set apart. So, we also have the link, which we can see here, between the development of something like homosexuality and colonialism, in the sense that Lemmy and Miller argue that the rigid segmentation, so the division, the putting into segments of time into separated zones of work and leisure, along with moral panics about backwards people, intended to justify colonial expansion and incursions into the supposedly immoral private lives of the working classes, inculcated the idea that who you fucked made you who you were. So they're arguing that it isn't possible to separate the development of an idea of homosexuality as something static and as an identity from the development of capitalism and colonialism, essentially, and from the idea that some people are morally degenerate, some people are morally bad, and that this moral badness justifies their treatment, either in a colonial context or in the context of exploitation and poverty, and that in some way that badness is also expressed through their sexuality. But we also, Miller and Lemmy argue on page 18, we have a sense that there is a struggle around these concepts too. And this is very, very important for what we can understand as a kind of, as the historical approach to understanding categories and understanding ideas. Is that categories are, if we say that they're historical, we're also saying that they're the product of a kind of historical struggle. So Lemmy and Miller say, working class people, colonized people, and people of color have consistently lived, fought for, manifested. Careful, manifested doesn't mean the same as it means it's not a manif, it's not like a demonstration, but it just means shown, and express forms of social and sexual expression that have challenged both social prejudice towards sexual and gender minorities and the bourgeois politics of the gay elite. So, what do we mean by the bourgeois politics of the gay elite? We might mean something like a preoccupation with property, a desire, the belief that the owning of property and the capacity to pass down property, for example, through a marriage contract, is the aim of homosexual or queer politics. The idea that one of the primary focuses of queer politics should be integration through the owning of and the passing down of property, which is something that marriage allows you to do. Which is not to say that the authors are being overly critical of campaigns for gay marriage, for example. There are a lot of good arguments as to why that might be something which is worth fighting for and very important. But at the same time, it's a subject of contestation. It's a subject of struggle. And we see on the next page, the queer elite will belatedly acknowledge these people. So people who have struggled, people who have offered kind of alternative forms of social organization related to queerness. So people who have brought queerness into a argument and into a contestation which aims to challenge society as a whole and not simply aims to integrate themselves into it. So we have this phrase, which is quite damning, but I think very well written, that the queer elite will belatedly acknowledge these people, movements, moments, and struggles in an attempt to incorporate them, so to bring them into, to make them a part of the dominant story of what it means to be queer or trans. Sorry, my highlights are a bit confusing, but as though the working class gays and sex workers, drag queens, and trans women of color at the Stonewall Inn in New York City's West Village threw bricks at cops in order to win marriage equality for the gay and lesbian donor class. So the gay and lesbian donor class are wealthy individuals who essentially support the status quo, essentially support the way that society exists, but who want to integrate into it as homosexuals. So people for whom homosexuality is very much an identity, something that they consider to be part of themselves, but which they don't use to challenge the essential structure of society itself, past wanting to be integrated, wanting to be a part of that society as it exists. So we have this quote from the same page that we just looked at, where it says, Lemmy and Miller write, it is this process of struggle and contestation that has created the very idea of what being gay or queer is. It has marked the production of queer cultures, the discussion of queer lives, and queer people's search for historical examples to justify their own acts and identities. So they're arguing that the very idea of being gay or being queer is not separable from real lived acts of struggle. And I don't know if you guys know what the Stonewall riots were. I'll put a YouTube video up actually that will give a bit of a discussion of it if you guys don't know. I would imagine that a number of you are aware of it. It's a very important moment in the history of queer and homosexual struggle in the US and in the world. But it's also a moment which is now controversial because we can say it's been recuperated, or it's been incorporated into a narrative of these guys, of what Miller and Lemmy call the gay and lesbian donor class. So people who are essentially interested in being part of an elite which doesn't challenge basic economic and social structures, but who want to be, who maintain their homosexuality nonetheless. And this argument is that Stonewall, when it happened, and if you know what it was, you'll know this already. If you don't know what it was, you can find out. It was about much more than that. It was about much more than just trying to integrate as a member of the bourgeoisie into existing social relations. So we have a struggle not only at the heart of homosexual and queer history, but also over the very meaning of these events and over the very meaning of the identities that those events help to form. And you can't really conceive of those identities without understanding the struggle that underlies them. And here we have, even the term gay has changed. 50 years ago, the term had a broader meaning that included queer and bisexual people, transgender people, transvestites, and more. Anyone who lived openly outside the heterosexual and cis sexist norms of a more conservative society and suffered as a result. Today, it tends to refer to a more limited idea of same-gender sexual attraction. And again, these definitions too are sites of struggle and negotiation. So previously, if you said someone was gay, what you really meant is that they lived outside of social norms relating to gender and relating to sexuality, and that they suffered as a result. So there was a kind of solidarity in being gay, which could extend across a broad spectrum of people. And today, Lemmy and Miller are arguing that it speaks to a much more restricted and limited idea of same-gender sexual attraction and of coupling. So they describe the burning house of the couple form. So this idea that conventional monogamy, conventional partnership, again, often organized around the maintenance and inheritance of property and money, as something that gay people should aim for, something that queer people should aim for. Lemmy and Miller are suggesting that even the term gay itself has now become much more restricted to this kind of couple idea than it was previously, when it referred to a kind of much more dissident sexuality, we can say, a sexuality which was much more in contestation with the status quo, and because of that was able to include a much broader range of people than we would now perhaps think of if we were refer to refer to if we were to use the word gay now. And I think that this we have this sense. So Lemmy and Miller give us some ways in which the very idea of homosexual sex as being something which is, or sex with people of the same gender, as being something which people even really cared about, has changed throughout history. So we have the sense that sodomy, which now means anal sex, used to just mean any sex act, even between people of different genders, which was not engaged in reproduction, or which was not done for the sake of reproduction. And then we have examples of how the making criminal of sodomy or of certain sexual acts was connected to historical events. So we have Henry VIII's desire to curse the clergy was not about his own sex life, but he was also trying to seize their lands and enclose common lands, wresting power and wealth from the hands of the church. So we have this sense that Henry VIII used what he called the Buggery Act, and buggery, again, is a term that refers to sex between men. And one of the motivations for this in 1553 was the fact that he could use this act, he could use the fact that homosexuality was now a crime, to seize church lands, to take wealth from the church. So again, the very idea that sex acts really mean something, good or bad, is taken or can only be understood in relation to other historical events. And then we move on to this idea in the 19th century that for the first time, groups of doctors, scientists, sociologists, and queer people themselves began to formulate their own theories about what all this sexual desire might be and mean. As colonialism and race science were beginning to create taxonomies, so a taxonomy is like a list and a group of different people, an organization of people according to different traits, based on traits and behaviors, sex theorists began to conceptualize into life a new type of human, the homosexual. And it's important that this idea of colonial taxonomy, which would have been used in order to justify the exploitation of colonial people, so of people of color, of people of different races around the world, would have featured in taxonomies which were aimed to make them appear less human and make them appear to be naturally suited to being colonized in a way which meant that they would, or that colonization could be justified. This process is going on at the same time that the idea of the homosexual itself is coming into being. The idea that a homosexuality is an identity, is a type of person, rather than sex acts just being something that some people do sometimes when they want to. So, and again, we read from this, so we read that the German lawyer and writer Karl Heinrich Unz acknowledged to his friends and family that he was that way in the 1860s. That way meaning that his personality was a certain way, his character was a certain way. There was something in him that was homosexual. And we have the sense that Karl Ulrich then develops a theory not just of sex, but of sexuality. Same-sex loving men as Urnings and women as Dionings. And he campaigned for the repeal of anti-sodomy legislation. So this is in some ways a kind of emancipatory gesture. So it's an idea that some people are the way that they are, and that to punish them for this is morally wrong. which in lots of ways is, is a very defensible, very justified idea. But it's also evidence of the way in which the idea of homosexuality as an identity um, becomes internalized. And it's no longer just about sex acts that people do um, just because they do them, because they have a particular desire which doesn't necessarily relate to who they are as a person. But it's now about a kind of fixed identity. And this fixed identity is something that comes into being, as we say, from the 1860s here. And this is it. We have a psychiatric model. So the Krafft-Ebing psychiatric model is still regarded by many as a sufficient explanation for the gays, they say. So the idea that homosexuality is something that requires an explanation is already suggesting that it's a kind of deviant, that it's against the norm in some way, and that there's something inherent about it. And the final bit that we'll look at from this introduction, even though I really want you to read the whole introduction and the whole conclusion to this book, is this idea that the idea of homosexuality as a holistic and inherent part of one's identity, rather than just a type of sex anyone could have, is now established as a norm. And I think that that's true. I think that I'll take the highlight off because it's easier to highlight the text as it is. I do think that this is accurate. That the idea now, if we think about someone as a homosexual or as someone who is queer, we don't necessarily think about someone who just has queer sex, and that doesn't define who they are as a person, or doesn't say something about them. Like, sexuality is, I think, an inherent part of how we conceive people. But again, I keep repeating this, but it's important. This is something that Lemmy and Miller want to argue has only been the case because of these historical changes that have taken place and because of these developments. And they argue that there's a political model which is built on the back of this idea that homosexuality is a holistic and inherent part of one's identity. The idea that gay people, homosexual people, or queer people do what they do because it's who they are, and we can't help who we are, and it would be cruel to repress their nature or withhold their civil rights, still holds sway. So this is, when we think about the defense of gay rights, when we think about the defense of homosexual rights and queer rights, what we're thinking about is the idea that people behave how they are because it's who they are, and we can't repress who people are. That is still, I think, the foundation of a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the discourse, justifiable discourse, around the rights of homosexual people and the rights of queer people. And I think that this is a really nice statement. And we have, in much of the West, the idea that homosexuality is an immutable characteristic is now so ingrained. So by immutable, we mean unchanging. If something is immutable, it's unchanging. It will never change. It will never change. Mutability is the tendency for something to change over time. So if something is immutable, it means it will never change. It will always stay the same. So the idea that homosexuality is an immutable characteristic is now so ingrained that Born This Way, the Lady Gaga song, once a stigmatizing medical explanation, so once a way of assigning a kind of pathology to homosexuality, is now both a rallying cry, so something which you use, which you shout in order to attract people to your cause, and pop anthem, rising up in opposition to conservative notions that homosexuality is an acquired deviance that can be cured with therapy. So the foundational idea now for gay and queer rights that homosexuality is an identity that people do not choose and that as a result needs to be defended. This is a historical process. There is a historical process that underlies this idea of what homosexuality is and what it means to be homosexual. And the final thought that I want to have is that this idea, or the final thought from Lemmy and Miller, is that this idea of queer and homosexual liberation based around the defense of rights and civil rights never really gets over the original stigmatization, the original pathologization of what it means to be homosexual. And I think they suggest that if we have homosexuality as a fixed identity, in some way or another, we're reproducing this original stigmatizing medical explanation. In the same way that someone might be classed as being mentally ill, but still be considered to have rights that needed to be defended because they can't help how they are. There's something about the mainstream understanding of homosexuality which maintains and preserves this original stigmatizing model. So we have the final paragraph where they say this binary model of thinking about homosexuality is so deeply internalized that to suggest that one might choose homosexuality as a positive choice or even be able to have some control over the shaping of your own desires is regarded as hate speech. Within liberal circles, and when leftists use the term liberal, they're not using it in the same way that right-wing people use the term liberal. What they mean is people who are essentially in favor of the status quo. A bit on the left, but essentially in favor of the status quo. And the status quo is the status quo is the way that things are at the moment. So we have this binary model of thinking is so deeply internalized that within liberal circles, to suggest that homosexuality may be more about a series of acts that don't define a person is regarded as hate speech. And even when homosexuality is okay, even when it comes with pension rights and military service and a lovely flat with a balcony and a little dog, it's still an affliction. So they're arguing that the mainstream idea of sexuality, which views it, and of homosexuality and queerness, which views it as an internalized quality trait, something that is about who someone just is as a person and which they can't change. There's something about that idea which still carries with it a pathologization, an idea that it's an affliction, an idea that there is a stigmatizing medical explanation, and that making that the center of a kind of queer politics or a gay politics it's to do with integration, it's to do with achieving recognition from society without fundamentally changing it, and it maintains a pathology. And what they will go on to argue and what they argue, and what hopefully we will see throughout the course, is that queerness and homosexuality can mean much more than this. It can mean much more than having pension rights, being able to serve in the military, and having a nice flat with a dog. So, yeah, the question then becomes how and what and how do we see these kind of struggles and antagonisms, struggle and contestation. How do we see them playing out in different cultural objects? That's what we're going to be looking at partly on the course. And the other reading, so that's Ben Miller and Shulemi, and that's what I wanted to kind of identify at the start as a kind of historical approach, as a way of understanding queerness and homosexuality and critiquing different elements of what is understood by queerness and homosexuality, but also understanding ways in which there's a lot of history and a lot of potential and a lot of struggle and beauty in these ideas too, and understanding the ideas themselves as being the product of and the continuing site of historical struggle. If we think again, come back to the idea of Stonewall as something that people still argue over what the legacy of Stonewall should mean. So yeah, we're going to go on to talk about the extract from Butler, which is more dense. I imagine that some of you will have heard of Judith Butler before. Some of you may have read her. She's an extremely influential theorist of gender, and her two most influential books about gender are Gender Trouble, which was the book that I gave you an extract from to read, and also Bodies That Matter. And they are, so I'll write those down. Bodies That Matter is the other book. Butler's other central book on gender. These are very important works in the history of thinking about gender from a kind of more theoretical perspective. And what I want to do is just take you through some of the key ideas. They're not easy texts to read, but I feel as if some of the key ideas are pretty explicable. And we'll be able to introduce them and bring them into conversation with some of the texts that we're looking at throughout the course and some of the films that we're looking at throughout the course. So again, we can find some commonalities between Butler and Lemmy and Miller in the way in which they think about sexuality and think about gender specifically. So Butler does write a significant amount about queerness, about homosexual desire, about homosexual identity, but she's also talking about gender in general. So gender as it would apply to people who consider themselves and who are, broadly speaking, what we would call gender conforming, which means that people whose gender is people whose gender expression does not in any way really challenge a social norm. But we have this idea, which we can go more into, but this idea that gender ought not to be constructed as a stable identity or locus of agency from which various acts follow. A locus is a central point. Or an organizing point of something from which things emerge or come into being. So if Butler is arguing that gender ought not to be construed as a stable identity or locus of agency from which acts follow, she's saying that gender it's not a central core. It's not a part of who someone is, she's arguing. Rather, gender is an identity tenuously constituted in time. So tenuously means kind of weakly or not very well bound together. So it's something which is perhaps not always very consistent, but it's constituted in time, and it's instituted in an exterior space through a stylized repetition of acts. So it's always about doing for Butler. Gender, and again, we can see something similar to how we've discussed the kind of historical perspective of Lemmy and Miller, in the sense that gender for Butler is about doing things. It's not about an internal core of a person. It's not about who you are as an individual. It's about what you do, which is why it's always kind of exterior for Butler. There's an exteriorization of behaviors, meaning it's always about what's going on the outside. And there might be an assumption that the outside corresponds to a kind of stable identity on the inside, but Butler is going to argue that that's actually a fallacy. If it's a fallacy, it's a mistake. It's a mistake, or it's a false belief. According to Butler, that's what she's going to argue, and that's one of her main arguments, is that gender is constituted in time through acts. It's always about doing. And there's a number of points that come out from this kind of central idea, which I'll talk about kind of for this part of the class, and then we'll wrap it up. We don't have time, and I don't think we really need to go into the real details of Butler's argument and how she argues against other people. But I do want you guys to come away with a sense of what her key ideas are. So, what happens to this? So we have this quote from the introduction, again, which is this sense that gender and power are connected, and the sense of the dominant power structures in a society. So what she calls the epistemic regime. So the epistemic regime is the way that meaning is organized. It's the way that meaning is organized. How this is related to gender. And she asks this question in the preface that you guys have an extract from. What happens to the subject and to the stability of gender categories when the epistemic regime of presumptive heterosexuality is unmasked as that which produces and reifies these ostensible categories of ontology? Okay, so that's very wordy. But what essentially she means is, if we conceive of categories of gender, a male-female gender binary, for example, as being produced by an epistemic regime of presumptive heterosexuality, rather than informing the idea that heterosexuality is normal, how do we start to see those categories change? How can we understand those categories? So Butler is essentially arguing that we can conceive that actually the idea that there is a absolute internalized gender, the idea that one is either male or one is female, this idea is produced by and reified by an epistemic regime of presumptive heterosexuality. So a regime which assumes that heterosexuality and gender conformity and gender conformity are the norm, so is the normal way of behaving, and anything else is a deviance from that. What happens to these gender categories if we start assuming that they are produced by a regime rather than informing that regime? And Butler uses this word reifies, which is a very important word for the course, and it's important. It's an important word if you want to develop a critical attitude towards concepts and towards society in general. And to reify something is to make something into a stable thing or object when it is in fact contradictory and unstable, or contains a number of different features. So it's a rough definition of what to reify something means. And we've seen in the Lemmy and the Miller how homosexuality, the idea of a homosexual identity, can be reified, meaning that it can be made to appear to be a stable and permanent part of who a person is. And here again, Butler is saying that actually there's a specific epistemic regime, there's a specific way of understanding the world, which reifies ideas of gender and gender categories. So male, female, the idea of a gender binary, which divides people very firmly between male and female, and also between homosexual and heterosexual. These are the product of reification. We can speak of a process of reification, which is connected to the verb to reify. So these categories come out of a process of reification, which does not necessarily speak to the truth of them. Gender does not need to be a fixed part of who someone is. It does not need to be a fixed essence, and neither does sexuality, as Miller and Lemmy are arguing. But there's something Butler is arguing about the way in which meaning is organized, so about the epistemic regime under which we live, which makes these categories seem more fixed than they actually are. And one of the ideas that Butler develops in her work, one of the ideas for which, Butler relatively recently started using they pronouns. I have just remembered that, so I will stop misgendering them. And I will say that one of the ideas that they are most famous for developing is this idea of performativity, which is related to the sense that gender is something which is constituted over time through acts, rather than being something which emerges directly from a person's inner core. So we have this idea that the gendered body is performative. So I'll read that again. That the gendered body is performative suggests that it has no ontological status apart from the various acts which constitute its reality. So to say that means that it does not exist. There is no gendered body outside of or apart from the acts that of or apart from the acts which it carries out. That's what no ontological status means. It doesn't exist, Butler says, the gendered body. So the idea that a body has a gender, not the body itself. Obviously, a body is a physical object which will exist when it isn't moving. But she argues there is no moment in which a gendered body, the idea of a person who is embodied and has a gender, that idea does not exist outside of the acts which it carries out, which are themselves gendered. This also suggests that if that reality is fabricated as an interior essence, that very interiority is an effect and function of a decidedly public and social discourse. So, if a gendered body, which is always doing acts which we know are exterior, so are taking place in public on the outside, if someone is acting, they're doing something that other people can see them doing. If that is fabricated, so if that is made into an interior essence, that very interiority is an effect and function of a decidedly public and social discourse. So they're saying that she's saying that even when a person considers themselves to have a gendered inner life or inner identity, that is an effect of a public discourse, of a exterior, of a social life. And that inner cannot be separated from the exterior, from the social context in which someone exists. And she describes the public regulation of fantasy through the surface politics of the body, the gender border control that differentiates inner from outer, and so institutes the integrity of the subject. The subject is the person. So she's arguing that there's a kind of administration of gender which separates inner from outer. So there's this idea that you have an inner core, and that your actions express that core. But she's arguing that there is no inner core that is not itself a product of public and social discourse. And that it's a fallacy, it's a mistake to think that there's a strict separation between inner and outer. In that respect is what they want to argue, what Butler wants to argue. And again, this is the product of an epistemic regime of presumptive heterosexuality. This idea of a separation between inner and outer. So, in other words, acts and gestures, articulated and enacted desires, create the illusion of an interior and organizing gender core, an illusion discursively maintained for the purposes of the regulation of sexuality within the obligatory frame of reproductive heterosexuality. So again, this is her argument, and we don't have time to go into the precise ways in which she develops it, but this is her point, is the idea that acts and gestures create the illusion of an interior and organizing gender core, and that this is maintained because in some way it supports the idea of the epistemic framework of heterosexuality and of reproductive sexuality, and of the idea that the norm is to be in a heterosexual relationship which is focused around the act of reproduction and family, and with that also property and wealth too. The idea that the conventional family is the norm, that actually that idea gains a lot of support from the idea that people have a kind of internal gender core, as Butler puts it, and that their actions merely express that. Rather, she is arguing that that's an illusion, and that that core is itself the product of the acts and gestures which are articulated in a person's actions, in a person's performances of their gender, which is why it's called performativity. And how far have we got to go? So we have more quotations. I'm just thinking, I don't want to overload you guys. So we have more quotations regarding the relationship between gender and the self in Butler's thinking. So if we move from the idea that the kind of inner core, the gendered core of a person is an illusion, we also see gender as something which, as Butler puts it, conceals its own genesis. So its genesis is its birth, and also the process by which it came into being. And if gender conceals its own genesis, then again we get this sense that we don't see it as something which is public, something which is social, something which is the result of an epistemic regime which organizes the individual acts that people do. Instead, we see it as something that stems from people and who they are essentially on their inside, which Butler continually wants to argue is a fallacy. And again, she describes discrete and polar genders, so genders which are opposite and which do not interact with each other, as do not mix. In terms of the idea of genders does not mix. There's no such thing. One is either male or female. If one thinks of polar genders as cultural fictions. But she also says there's a credibility to those productions. So people kind of, it's easy to believe that that gender is binary and that there are polar genders and that there is a historical credibility. And also there's a credibility to the punishments that attend not agreeing to believe in them, and that the construction compels our belief in its necessity and naturalness. So again, there's a kind of historical analysis kind of going on in Butler too, in the sense that she's arguing that there's this belief in an internal gender core and this belief in a gender binary is something which has come about historically as a result of repeated constructions in which ideas of a gender core and ideas of a gender binary were repeated, and also punishments, which legal actual punishments, and we see some of those if we read the Miller and the Lemmy, which went along with not believing them, or with being gender non-conforming and with being non-heterosexual. So she's saying that this kind of historical process of penalizing homosexuality, penalizing queerness, penalizing the non-gender conforming, creates a kind of credibility to two essential ideas of a gender binary and of a gender core, which do not actually need to have a credibility, but they accrue this kind of credibility over time because of the way that social norms have worked and because of the way that culture has developed, she's arguing. And again, let's finish up. So we have, this is all coming from the end of the extract that I asked you guys to read. So this idea that the abiding gendered self will then be shown to be structured by repeated acts that seek to approximate the ideal of a substantial ground of identity, but which in their occasional discontinuity reveal the temporal, and we have this repetition that we saw in Lemmy and Miller of this idea of contingent groundlessness of this ground. So there's something about gendered acts, something about the idea of performativity, which through the way that they repeat themselves suggests that there is a substantial ground, so suggests that there is a real gender core. But there will always be moments of discontinuity. There will be moments when this chain of repetition breaks and reveals itself to be groundless, reveals the core to be a kind of illusion. And again, this is something that we can look at when we view the cultural objects that we're going to be looking at throughout the course. And we'll finish with this final quotation, which is from the end of the extract that I asked you guys to read. If gender attributes and acts, the various ways in which a body shows or produces its cultural signification are performative. So if it's about the things that people do rather than about who they are, and if there is no inner core which is separate from these acts, and those acts themselves only make sense within a kind of social context within the epistemic regime, then there is no pre-existing identity by which an act or attribute might be measured. There would be no true or false, real or distorted acts of gender. So in some ways there is no gender outside the ways in which acts are themselves gendered. There is no essential gender outside of these acts themselves and outside of the social context and the epistemic regime that gives those kind of acts meaning. And again, she says that the postulation, so the postulation is the positing, is the positing the claim of something, claiming that something is a certain way, or arguing that something is a certain way. The postulation of a true gender identity would be revealed as a regulatory fiction. So a regulatory fiction is something that you need to organize something, but that is not real. So we might say it comes from this Kantian idea of a regulatory idea, which is from Kant, the philosopher, and it's an idea such as perfect freedom. Kant argued that freedom was a regulatory idea, which you need to make sense of the world, but which is not actually provable. So if this makes sense, a regulatory fiction or a regulatory idea is something that organizes the world, something that organizes society, but it's not true. So we can say that the idea of a true gender identity, a true gender core, for the epistemic regime under which we live, is necessary. It's a regulatory fiction. But in other forms of social organization and in other forms of life and economic organization, it might not be necessary. So we should think about why it's necessary, what it would mean to live in a world in which it's no longer used as a regulatory fiction? What does that mean? What would it look like? And what does it mean in situations in which that regulatory fiction breaks down, stops working, reveals itself to be a fiction, reveals itself to be not true? So, okay, guys. That's the end of the week. I know it was a dense video lecture for this week, but I hope that you got some of the basic ideas. If you find the languages hard, then of course you can translate the PowerPoint if you would like to, things like that. And I hope that you have a way into these texts now. So yeah, for this week, what I'll do is at the end of every class, I will post tasks, but they're mainly just there to help you to engage with the course as you go along and to make sure that you are keeping up with it. I know that with the online asynchronous, it can feel quite disengaging. It can feel like you're not really there and you're not really studying. But what I would say is if you keep up with these tasks, and also if you would like to post them on the forum too that I've set up, yeah. So go over the course, try to grasp the basic ideas that we've talked about. Yeah, and think about any experiences in your own life that made it seem to you as if gender was more about acts that you were doing and could also maybe not do than it was about who you were deep down as a person. And if you want to write a paragraph about what that experience was like, and you can send it to me or you can post it on the forum. On the course if you would like to, but you don't have to. These aren't devoirs that you need to do every week, but they're exercises to encourage you to engage with the course if you want to. There will be a final written task for the course and there will be a final oral presentation for the course, but I will give you details for that at the time, and there isn't any other work that you need to be doing every week. Just keep up with the lectures and respond to the forums and the exercises if you want to. And yeah, watch Portrait of Jason. There's a link for it on eCampus. It's a wonderful but also very troubling film. It's a film which is ethically quite difficult and ambiguous, but has some very interesting qualities to it. We'll talk about it next week. Yeah, have a good week, guys. Email me if you have any questions, and yeah, I'll speak to you next week. Okay, bye.